Hello everyone. In this video, we are going to study about the second type of simple connection, that is the moment resistant or the rigid connection. So let's start. Now, as we have discussed in the earlier videos, that the simple connections can be classified into primarily two categories, that is the shear connection, or which was known as the flexible connection, and the moment connection, or that is also known as the rigid connections. So the topic of discussion will be the moment connections. So the connections which are designed to transmit the end moments in addition to the end shear. So the end shear was transmitted by the flexible connection, while in this moment connection, the end moments are also transferred along with the end shears. And that's why the name comes as the moment connections. And these connections are also known as the rigid connections, because when it is transmitting the moment, then they will not permit any relative rotation between the beam and the column, or beam and the beam. That means wherever the connection is provided, the connection will not allow any kind of rotation between the different steel components. Now, in a beam connection, whenever a beam will be provided, then so in a beam connection, whenever an I section will be provided, what will happen, that the movement has to be transferred through the beam, because the shear will be transmitted through the web of the beam. This is the web portion of the beam, and the shear, that is the end reaction part of the connection, that will be transferred through the web of the beam, while the movement has to be transferred through the flanges of the beam. So that is the problem here, because the connection which are having flexibility, that means the flanges of the beam will not be attached to the flange of the column, and that's why there will not be the resistance of the movement, and therefore there will not be any movement which will be transferred through this connection. While in the case of moment resistant connection, the connection will transfer the movement through the flanges of the beam and in the form of a couple. So in a beam connection, any moment transfer, it takes place only through the flanges in the form of a couple. That means equal and opposite reactions will be coming onto that. So that means if on one flange there is tensile force, then on the other flange it will be a compressive force, and together they will form a couple. That will be the moment which will be transferred. So that means this couple consists of a compressive force in one flange and tensile force in the other. Now these moment restraint connections are further classified into primarily two categories, that is the bolted connection and the welded moment connection. Now one by one we will discuss them all. Now these bolted connection, depending upon the type of the movement that is coming onto it, they are further classified into two categories, that is the light moment connection and the heavy moment connection. Now these light moment connections are also known as the clip angle moment connections, while these heavy moment connections, whenever the load or the moment that is coming onto the connection is very high, then the heavy connections are to be provided, and then they are further classified into two categories, that is the split beam connection and the bracket connection. So one by one we will discuss them all. Now this has been shown as the moment connection. So whenever we are analyzing the moment resistant connections, so a figure may represent that this is the moment resistant connection, but in actual it may not be. For example, look at the first case where it has been shown that the beam and the column, that is the column and this is the beam portion. So beam and column, they are connected at the web of the beam and the flange of the column through a angle with the help of the bolts. Now when the movement will be there, that means there will be some movement which will be coming onto this plate. So whenever there will be the movement, then this joint, they will allow the rotation, they will allow the movement of this beam and the flanges of the beam. So therefore the slope that you will be seeing in the form of the deflected curve, that will be looking like this dotted line. While in the case of the moment resistant connection, these flanges are also attached. Now as you can see in this diagram, this black dot, this represents the welded connection. So these points of the flanges of the beam are attached to the flange of the column with the help of some welding. So now whenever there will be the moment on this connection, this connection will not allow the complete rotation of the flanges of the beam, and whenever this flange will try to rotate, it will also pull together the flange of the column, and that's why the deflected shape will be like this. While in the first case the column was not deflected, it was the only the flange which was rotating, that means it was simply supported at this point. While in this case it is acting like a rigid body, because the angle which has been provided earlier between the different elements, that has been maintained. For example, if you draw a tangent line here, you can see that the angle is still 90 degree between the different components. So the angle which was initially provided has been maintained in this connection. So whenever there will be a movement, for example, let's say this movement is in this clockwise direction, so that means a couple will be acting in this manner. That means a force will be in this direction, and the bottom portion, this force will be compressive. So this is compressive and this is tensile. So for here, these forces we will design the connection. That means the upper bolt or the welding is under tension, and that has to be designed for the tension force, while the bottom bolt or the welding is under compression, and that has to be designed for that force only. So now what are the conditions where we will provide or we will consider the end moments so that we can provide the moment restraint connections. So following are the cases where the consideration may has to be given to the end moments. So that means along with the shear force, the end moments are also to be considered. So whenever the end reactions are eccentric, that means, for example, this is the column portion and a beam is attached to it, and this is the connection. Now this is the column and the beam is connected to the column with the help of the connections. Now if the external force which is coming onto the beam and that is transferred to the column at the connection level only, then there will be no eccentricity for the end reaction. But if this end reaction is coming at an eccentricity from the design connection, then there will be the chances of the movement or the rotation of the beam, and there we need to consider the end moments. So the first of the case where we need to consider the end moments are when the end reactions on the beam or end reactions of the beam, where the end reactions from the beam are eccentric, therefore they will give rise to the end moments. Second of the case where we need to consider these is when the girders that we have provided, that means another type of beam that is known as the girders. Depending upon the position of the beam that we have provided, beams are further classified into different categories that we have seen in the chapter of the beams, that they are classified into girders, joists, struts, example. So girders, when they are subjected to wind forces, and primarily it is the lateral forces. So whenever the girders will be subjected to the lateral forces, then they will be subjected to the end moments. For example, let's say this is a girder that I'm trying to draw. So this is the length of the girder. Now whenever there will be a lateral force, for example it may be a wind force, and primarily the wind forces occur, and if that primarily the wind forces occur, and if that location of the industrial building is in the zone of the seismicity, that means if there is a earthquake prone zone, then this lateral force may be a wind force or may be an earthquake force. So whatever the lateral force may be there, because of the lateral force present, there will be some eccentricity from the connection, and because of that there are the chances of the end moments generation, and for that we need to consider the end moments also. So when the girders are subjected to wind forces in case of industrial buildings, then also we need to consider the end moments, and then we need to design the connections as the moment resistant connections. Now the sections that we will be discussing after this, that is the type of different moment resistant connection, those are just the introductory part, because this is the advanced steels part that is provided in the master's course. That means in the masters of technology or masters of engineering, that are the post graduation courses. So we will be looking at only the introductory part. Now the bolted movement connections. Now the movement connections can further be classified into two depending upon the type of connection that we have provided. It can be the bolted connection or the welded connection. Now whenever the connection between the beam and the column is maintained with the help of the bolts, then that type of connection is known as the bolted connection. While whenever there will be the welding which will be provided between the two, then the type of connection will be known as the welded connection. Now depending upon the amount of end moment, now based upon the amount of end moment that is transferred from the beam to the column, they are further classified into two categories. First one is the light movement connection, and as the name says, that whenever the movement that is coming onto the beam, if that is low in nature, and as it is obvious from the name that whenever the movement which is transferred to the beam, if that is having lower value, then we'll be providing the light movement connections, and they are also known as the clip angle connection. Now first condition is when connections are subjected to small end movements and large end shears, then we will be providing the light movement connections. And in this, four angle pairs are used for the connections. Now where do we provide these four angle pairs? So four angles are used, that means two pairs of angle. So in total, two pairs of angles are to be provided, that means four angles are used to make the connection, and one pair of the angle is provided on both the sides of the web of the beam. This is the web portion of the beam, and on both sides, this is the web portion of the beam, and on both sides of the web of the beam we are providing the angle section. So this is the first angle and this is the second angle that we have provided for the connection of the web of the beam to the flange of the column. And two other angles are provided, one below the flange of the beam, that is this one. This is the third angle, and the fourth angle is to be provided at the top of the flange. Now if there is a clockwise movement that is being shown here, now if there is a clockwise movement, that means the upper portion of the flange that will be subjected to the tensile force, while the bottom flange of the beam that will be subjected to the compressive force. So that means the bolts which are present at position 1, they will be subjected to tensile force, while the bolts which are present at the position 3rd, they will be subjected to the compressive force, while the bolts at the 2nd and 4th position, they will be subjected to the vertical force, that is the shear. So the bolt number 2 and 4, they will be only under the shear force. Similarly, if the direction of the movement is reversed, for example, if this is anti-clockwise movement, then the upper portion will be in the compression while the bottom portion will be in the tension. So in that case, bolt number 3 will be under tensile force while 1 will be under compressive force, while 2 and 4 number bolts, they remain still under the shear force. Now the designing part for this bolted movement connection, that is the light movement or the clip angle connection, that is out of scope, and only the introductory part has to be studied from here. Now moving on to the next type of connection, that is the heavy movement connection. So when the movement carrying capacity of the light movement connection, that is the first type of movement connection, if that is being reached up to a certain limit, then we try to provide the heavy movement connection. So if the capacity or the value of the movement connection is reached, if the capacity of the light movement connection is reached, then we try to provide the heavy movement connections, which are further classified into two categories, that is the split beam connection and the second type of connection that is known as the bracket connection. Now what are these type of connections, that we'll be seeing in the upcoming lectures, but for the introductory part, just remember that the heavy movement connection, just for the introductory part, just remember that the heavy movement connections, they are further classified into two, that is the split beam connection and the bracket connection. Now the next type of movement connection, that is the welded movement connection, and we have seen that if the type of fastener that is provided or the type of connection that is being provided in the form of the movement, then that is known as the other type of fastener or the connection that is being provided here if that is in the form of welding, then that type of moment connection is known as the welded moment connection. Now this welded moment connection, it needs a careful construction because it is made only at the site. That means there is no fabrication in the workshop. All the connections are to be made only at the site or only at the field, and therefore they need higher degree of precision in the construction process. And the welded moment restraint connection, they are made using plates only. Now these are the important points that you need to keep in mind, that the welded moment restraint connections, they are made using the plate only. Now this is the bracket plate which I am highlighting with the green color. So this is the bracket plate that is being provided here. Now this bracket plate is provided at the top of the beam, that is on the upper flange of the beam, and it is fillet welded to the beam, while at the joint of the column to the plate it is being butt welded, that is also known as the groove weld. So that has been the connection between the column and the bracket plate, while between the bracket plate and the beam it is being the fillet weld. Now the length of this plate that we are providing, that is the length of the bracket plate, it is kept usually 1.5 times the width of the flange. So whatever is the width of the flange, so as to obtain the sufficient length for the fillet welding, we provide it to be the 1.5 times of the width of the flange of the beam. And the length should be such that the plate yields before the failure of the connection. That means this plate that we have provided on the top of the flange of the beam, that fails first before the connection fails. And let's say if we would have provided the plate in this straight manner, that is this rectangular plate, then the only length that is available for the welding, that would have been this, which I'm highlighting with the red color. But once we have tapered this plate, now the length which is available to us, it has increased because the bracket plate that we are providing, it is tapered to facilitate the fillet welding, so that we get the increased length which is available for the welding. Now under the heavy moment, as we have discussed in the case of the bolted connection, under the case of the heavy moments in the welded connection, this column, under the heavy moments for the column in the welded moment connection, the flanges of the column, that is these portions of the column, they will try to buckle up, and because of that the moment capacity of this section, it will be reduced. Therefore, to check this, what we do, we provide these stiffening plates between the two flanges, and these are known as the stiffener for the column. And these stiffener plates are also welded between the column flanges just opposite to the flange of the beam. This is the flange of the beam which I'm highlighting with the red color. So this is the flange of the beam, while these two that I've written on the top of the portion, those are the flanges of the column. So the flanges of the column, these are connected through the stiffener plates just opposite to the flange of the beam. Now this connecting plate that we have provided on the top of the flange of the beam, that has no capacity to resist the shear. Now the plate that we have provided over the top of the flange of the beam, that has little or no resistance to shear. Therefore, to resist this shear, because the shear will be coming onto this section, and to resist that, what we do, we provide the seat angle below the flange of the column. Therefore, we provide a seat angle at the bottom flange of the beam. Now, if the end reactions that are transferred as if the shear force, then the another different types of angles or the stiffening plates that we have studied in the stiffened seated connection, they may also be provided at the seat angle level, and they are also connected to the web or the column flanges. So when we are doing the welded connection, then all the plates will be welded with each other, so that the connection is maintained as if the stiff connection, so that there will be no rotation allowed and the moment restraint will be acting, so that the end moment is restrained and the section will be permitting no rotation for the any flange or any web of the column or either of the beam. Now in the next lecture, we will look at the two different types of heavy moment connections for the bolted type. That is, one is the split beam connection, another one is the bracket type of connection. So thank you.